My name is Wyeth Blackwood, a mortician from rural Montana who survived the first 30 days of the Ice Age apocalypse. When volcanic ash blocked the sun and temperatures plummeted below zero, I watched my town disappear under 20 feet of snow. As others evacuated, I stayed behind. My skills preserving the dead became the key to keeping the living alive. This is the story of how we faced death, betrayal, and unimaginable cold, and lived to tell about it. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Wyeth Blackwood, though most folks around town call me Karen. I was working at my family's funeral home in rural Montana when the world as we knew it began to end. My grandmother always told me stories about the winter, spirits, how they'd one day wake from their slumber and reclaim the world. I never truly believed those tales until I watched it happen with my own eyes. I suppose I should tell you a bit about myself before I dive into how I survived the first 30 days of this Ice Age apocalypse. I'm 37, tall and lean, with long black hair I keep in a braid. My mother was indigenous and my father Irish-American. From my mother's side, I inherited knowledge of traditional medicine and herbs. From my father, I learned the mortuary business, an unusual combination I know, but one that would ultimately save not just my life, but the lives of many others. The funeral home had been in our family for 3 generations. It was a sanctuary of order amid the chaos of life and death. After college and formal training, I returned home to take over the business. The locals started calling me Karen after the mythological ferryman of the dead. At first, it was meant as a joke because of my serious demeanor, but I embraced it. There's dignity in helping people cross from one realm to another. My days before all this were peaceful, predictable. Preparing bodies during the day, gathering herbs in the nearby woods in the evenings, occasionally helping the local doctor when he needed consultation on unusual cases. I balanced modern mortuary science with traditional remedies my grandmother had taught me. People found it odd but respected the knowledge. The first warning signs came in late October. I was embalming Mr. Peterson, who died peacefully in his sleep at 92, when the emergency broadcast interrupted the radio station I'd been listening to. Reports of volcanic eruptions across the Pacific Ring of Fire. Scientists called it unprecedented but assured everyone it would only cause a temporary cooling effect. Nothing to worry about. But I noticed things others didn't. The animals were behaving strangely. While gathering yarrow and juniper that same evening, I saw deer moving south in large numbers. Squirrels were frantically gathering more than usual. Birds were leaving weeks after they should have migrated. The animals knew. They always know first. Within days, the sky changed. What had been occasional overcast became permanent gray. The temperature dropped steadily. The first snow came early November and it simply never stopped. People were excited at first. Children built snowmen and had snowball fights. Adults grumbled about shoveling but didn't seem concerned. But I remembered my grandmother's teachings about nature's warnings, and a sense of unease grew within me. I began quietly preparing. I cataloged my supplies, organized storage in the funeral home basement, gathered extra medication from the pharmacy under the pretense of restocking first aid. I preserved additional herbs and made tinctures. People laughed when they saw me carrying extra cans from the grocery store. Preparing for the apocalypse, Karen? They'd joke. I would smile and nod, but inside I was thinking, yes, perhaps I am. By mid-November, the power grid began to fluctuate. Temperatures had dropped below zero and stayed there. The snow was no longer measured in inches but in feet. The local officials called an emergency community meeting at the town center. I remember standing at the back of the room, watching people's faces as the mayor tried to downplay the situation despite the obvious severity. That night I made the decision to convert the funeral home basement into an emergency shelter. The building was solid brick construction, with a newer insulation system my father had installed before he passed. The embalming equipment ran on a separate generator system. We had water purification capabilities and enough space to house at least 20 people comfortably. In my line of work, you develop a sense for when death is approaching. And that day, I felt it hovering over our entire town. 3 days later, With temperatures now consistently below -20, the mayor called another town meeting. This time, there was no pretense of normalcy. Military trucks were coming to evacuate the town. The National Weather Service was predicting another 30 inches of snow within 48 hours. The power grid was failing across 3 states. Anyone who wanted to leave should pack one bag and be ready by morning. The debate was heated. Some insisted, we should all go, trust the government to provide. Others, particularly the older residents, refused to abandon their homes. I stood up, surprising even myself. I was never one for public speaking, but something compelled me to share what I knew. The evacuation centers will be overcrowded, I said, my voice quiet but firm. Resources will be stretched thin. Some of us might be better off here where we know the land, where we have supplies already. I've been preparing my place as a shelter. Those who stay can join me there. People looked at me differently after that, some with respect, others with suspicion. By morning, the town had divided. About 2/3 chose evacuation. The rest, about 24 people, decided to stay. The elderly who couldn't bear to leave their homes. The stubborn who didn't trust government promises. A few, who were too ill to travel easily. And me, who somehow found himself becoming a leader rather than just the quiet mortician. The military trucks arrived as the snow reached first-floor windows across town. I had a final conversation with Mayor Reynolds before he boarded. You sure about this, Wyeth? He asked, using my real name for once. They're saying this weather pattern could last months. We'll be all right, I said, though I wasn't entirely sure. We know this land. We have skills. He nodded, looking troubled. If things get bad, try to make it to Billings. The evacuation center there is supposed to be well supplied. I watched families make heartbreaking choices. Parents separating from adult children who chose differently. Neighbors embracing, not knowing if they'd see each other again. And then the convoy disappeared into the white, leaving behind an eerie silence broken only by the howl of wind. As I watched them go, I wondered if I'd just witnessed the last page of our town's history. But sometimes the end of one story is just the beginning of another. That first night after the evacuation, the silence was deafening. Our town of nearly 2,000 had been reduced to 24 souls scattered across snow-buried streets. I went door to door, checking on those who had stayed, inviting them to the funeral home. By nightfall, 17 had joined me. The others insisted on remaining in their homes, at least for now. Taking inventory of who remained was sobering. Elaine Porter, a retired nurse in her 60s. Hank Littlefeather, a 70-year-old former park ranger who knew the land better than anyone. The Chen family who ran the local grocery store. Old Bill McCarthy, who refused to leave the house he'd built with his own hands 50 years ago. A handful of others, mostly older residents with deep roots in the community. The temperature continued to drop, hitting -25 that night. We gathered in the funeral home's viewing room, rearranging furniture to create sleeping areas. I showed them the basement where I'd stockpiled supplies. Some seemed surprised that the quiet mortician had been so forward-thinking. I've always paid attention to patterns, I explained simply. That first week was about adaptation. I taught them how to use the mortuary equipment for practical survival. The embalming chemicals could purify water in a pinch. The cold storage units, normally used for bodies awaiting preparation, became our food preservation system. My knowledge of anatomy and basic medical care suddenly had applications beyond the dead. Death had taught me how to preserve things. Now, I needed to preserve us. Initially, there was chaos and fear among our small group. People were used to authorities telling them what to do in emergencies. Now, they looked to each other, uncertain. Natural leaders emerged. Myself, Elaine with her medical knowledge, and Hank with his survival skills. We formed an informal council and established systems for food rationing, fuel conservation, and work rotations. We thought we were making decisions for weeks of hardship, not years. That misunderstanding led to our first loss. On the 7th day, Jimmy Red Cloud didn't show up for morning check-in. Jimmy was only 40, healthy, one of our strongest. He'd insisted on staying at his own cabin on the edge of town, coming in daily for meals and to help with tasks. When he didn't arrive, Hank and I went to check on him. We found him frozen in his bed. The wood stove had gone out overnight as temperatures plunged to -35. He'd simply fallen asleep and never woken up. Death by hypothermia is peaceful that way, at least. Your body stops fighting, you feel warm in those final moments. Then you drift away. Preparing Jimmy's body was different from any other I'd done in my career. Not just because I knew him personally, but because the cold had already preserved him in a way. The ground was too frozen for burial, so we performed a modified version of my grandmother's traditional ceremonies and placed him in a storage shed, covered with ceremonial cloths. The community gathered that evening. I spoke words both from my grandmother's traditions and from the standard services I typically performed. In that moment, they started calling me Karen in earnest, no longer as a joke, but with respect. I had guided Jimmy to whatever comes next, and they understood I would do the same for them if needed. Jimmy's death forced us to confront a harsh reality. Individual homes couldn't be efficiently heated with our limited resources. Hank suggested we consolidate everyone in the church basement. The church was stone with thick walls. The basement, partially underground, providing natural insulation. It had a commercial kitchen from community dinners and enough space for all of us. Moving supplies and people through the deepening snow was a logistical challenge. We created paths using wooden boards to distribute weight across the snow's surface. It took 3 days of exhausting work to transfer our essential supplies and help everyone relocate. We insulated windows with cardboard and fabric, set up wood-burning stoves salvaged from abandoned homes, and arranged sleeping areas along the warmest walls. By then, 2 weeks had passed since the evacuation. The snow reached second-story windows on most buildings. We organized expedition teams to search abandoned houses for supplies, carefully documenting what we took and from where, maintaining some semblance of order and respect for property, even as survival became our priority. I led the first expedition team, teaching them techniques for moving in extreme cold. Cover all skin, work in pairs, limit exposure to 15 minutes maximum. Watch each other for signs of frostbite. The skills I'd learned from my grandmother about respecting harsh environments saved lives that day when a sudden temperature drop caught us by surprise. We nearly lost Lisa Chen to hypothermia, but managed to get her back to shelter just in time. That expedition yielded vital supplies from the doctor's abandoned home: antibiotics, pain relievers, bandages, and a medical reference book that would prove invaluable in the weeks to come. I'd spent my life around the dead. Now I was responsible for the living. By day 17, we had successfully converted the church basement into our new communal shelter. All 24 survivors were now consolidated in one location. That first night together, gathered around the stoves, people began sharing stories, memories of normal life, hopes for when this would all end. The radio still worked occasionally, bringing fragments of news, reports of nationwide chaos, emergency measures in major cities, scientific debates about how long this climate anomaly might last. That night, huddled together in the church basement, we became something new. Not just survivors, but a community. A family born of ice and necessity. By the beginning of the 3rd week, our new reality had fully set in. The snow now consistently reached second-story windows throughout town. Temperatures hovered between -30 and -40 degrees. The church basement had become our world, with brief, dangerous excursions outside being our only connection to what remained of our town. Each morning began the same way. I would wake before the others to check the temperature gauges, both inside and outside. Hank would stoke the fires while Elaine would assess everyone's health. The Chen family would begin preparing breakfast from our carefully rationed supplies. We had established routines because routines kept us sane, kept us human. The last radio broadcasts we received described similar conditions nationwide. The northern half of the country was effectively buried. Southern states were experiencing unprecedented cold and snow. The government had established emergency protocols, but resources were stretched impossibly thin. Power grids were failing everywhere. And then one morning, the radio broadcast simply stopped mid-sentence. We tried other frequencies but found only static. That silence was more terrifying than any bad news could have been. With conventional medicine running low, I began expanding my practice of herbal remedies using the plants I had preserved before the worst hit. My grandmother had taught me which plants could treat common ailments, how to prepare them properly, how to determine dosages. I started teaching others these skills as well, knowledge that wouldn't die with me if something happened. The chemicals I used for embalming were running low. Soon I'd need to rely entirely on my grandmother's teachings. In a way, this felt right. A return to older ways of knowing and healing as our modern systems failed us. Medical challenges became our most pressing concern. 3 cases of frostbite appeared after an expedition. Took longer than planned. I applied my knowledge of tissue preservation, normally used on the deceased, to save living flesh instead. We created a treatment rotation, with everyone taking turns applying warm compresses and herbal poultices. All 3 recovered, though Frank lost the tip of one finger despite our best efforts. I taught everyone basic first aid appropriate for our conditions. How to recognize frostbite before it becomes severe. How to warm someone with hypothermia without shocking their system. How to treat the persistent coughs developing from the dry, cold air we breathed. My years handling bodies gave me intimate knowledge of human anatomy that proved surprisingly useful for keeping bodies functioning. By day 20, we needed to resupply our medical stores. The pharmacy was 6 blocks away, a journey that would have taken 5 minutes in normal times. Now it represented a potentially deadly expedition. I gathered a team of 4, our strongest and most level-headed. Myself, Hank, Lisa Chen, and Marcus Reynolds, the former town drunk who had proven surprisingly reliable in crisis. We prepared for days. Made makeshift snowshoes from furniture parts to distribute our weight across the snow's surface. Designed a pulley system to transport supplies back. Created a detailed map of the route, marking known hazards. The morning of the expedition, I led a brief ceremony borrowing from my grandmother's traditions, asking the winter spirits for safe passage. The world outside our shelter had become alien. Snow had transformed familiar streets into unrecognizable terrain. We navigated by the tops of streetlights and the peaks of roofs. The silence was profound, broken only by the crunch of our snowshoes and our labored breathing forming clouds in the frigid air. Death was waiting in every shadow, every drift. I could feel it watching us. Halfway to the pharmacy, disaster struck. Marcus stepped onto what appeared to be solid ground, but was actually a thin crust of snow over a pocket of air. He plunged through, disappearing instantly up to his chest. The suddenness of it startled a shout from all of us. In temperatures, this cold having snow inside your protective clothing meant frostbite within minutes, hypothermia shortly after. We worked frantically to extract him, careful not to create a larger collapse. Once free, we had to make an immediate decision. Continue to the pharmacy or return to shelter. Marcus insisted he was fine, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. I made the call to split the team. Hank would take Marcus back while Lisa and I continued forward. The pharmacy, when we reached it, was eerie in its ordinariness, products still neatly arranged on shelves, as if waiting for customers who would never return. We located the antibiotics, pain relievers, and other essentials on our list. Lisa found prenatal vitamins, which confused me until she quietly shared that Sarah Jenkins believed she might be pregnant. This news hit me like a physical blow. Child born into this frozen world, what kind of life awaited it? Our return journey was tense but uneventful. We found Hank had gotten Marcus back safely, though he was suffering from mild hypothermia. The supplies we brought were celebrated like treasure, which in many ways they were. That night, I carefully inventoried and stored everything, creating a rationing plan that might stretch these resources for months if necessary. The following day brought our first major infrastructure crisis. The generator failed during a record low temperature of -45 degrees. Without power, our heating system couldn't circulate properly. We spent a harrowing night huddled together for warmth, burning anything we could safely use in the stoves. Books from the church library, wooden furniture, anything that would produce heat without dangerous smoke. I stayed awake that entire night, moving between groups, checking for signs of hypothermia, telling stories my grandmother had shared about ancestors surviving harsh winters. "The body remembers what the mind forgets," I told them. "Your ancestors survived ice and darkness for thousands of years. That strength is in your blood." By morning, panic had begun spreading among some of our group. The reality of our situation became impossible to ignore. We might be on our own for much longer than anyone had anticipated. Marcus, still recovering from his ordeal, began questioning our leadership decisions. Why hadn't we stockpiled more fuel? Why hadn't we tried to reach Billings? Why were we trusting a mortician to keep us alive? The confrontation escalated quickly. Marcus found supporters in a few others who had been harboring similar doubts. For a moment, violence seemed possible. I approached Marcus calmly, asked him to walk with me to check the generator again. Away from the audience, his anger deflated somewhat. I reminded him that I had pulled him from the snow, that we were all doing our best with limited information and resources. "In the funeral business, you learn to help people through their worst moments," I told him. "This is just a different kind of grief counseling." He laughed despite himself, and the tension broke. We restructured our leadership approach after that, creating a more inclusive council that gave everyone some voice in decisions. It wasn't perfect, but it helped channel frustrations into productive discussion rather than conflict. The next challenge came 3 days later when the worst storm yet hit our area. The wind howled at over 60 miles per hour, driving snow into every crack and crevice. The temperature, with wind chill, reached -60. The building's integrity became compromised as the weight of snow on the church roof grew concerning. We organized an emergency rotation to clear snow from the roof, despite the dangerous conditions. Each person could only work for 5 minutes before the cold became too hazardous. All night we maintained a vigil, watching for signs of structural failure, listening to the building creak and groan under the strain. I found myself falling back on funeral vigil practices, keeping track of time, rotating responsibilities, maintaining calm presence in the face of mortality. Different context, same skills. Nature was testing us, pushing us to our limits. I'd seen that same relentless pressure in the faces of the bereaved. Dawn came after what felt like an eternity. The storm had passed, leaving behind an even more transformed landscape. We discovered the radio no longer received any signals at all, regardless of frequency. The realization of our complete isolation from the outside world hit everyone hard. There was a moment of collective despair that hung in the air like a physical presence. I let the silence stretch, respecting the weight of what we were all feeling. Then I stood and faced our group. "We're on our own now," I said simply. "And that's all right. Humans survived ice ages before. We can do it again." That morning, standing in perfect silence, I realized something important. We were truly on our own. And somehow that clarity was exactly what we needed. The uncertainty had been paralyzing us. Now we could focus entirely on long-term survival without false hope of imminent rescue. We began immediate adaptations to our new understanding. I started documenting physical changes I observed in our group. Weight loss was universal, of course, but other adaptations surprised me. Many developed a pallor from lack of sunlight, yet our night vision seemed to improve. Our bodies began conserving energy automatically, movements becoming more deliberate and efficient. Some reported needing less sleep, but deeper rest. The social dynamics shifted too. New bonds formed, often between people who would never have connected in our previous lives. Hierarchies evolved based on skills rather than former status. The banker now worked under the direction of the high school janitor who knew the building's heating system intimately. I kept an observation journal, documenting these changes. "We are becoming something else," I wrote one night. "Snow people, winter folk." My grandmother would say the winter spirits were reshaping us in their image. Perhaps she wasn't entirely wrong. We developed new technologies appropriate for our frozen world. Insulated pathways between buildings using salvaged materials. A snow melting system that used waste heat from our stoves. Reflective panels to maximize what little light penetrated the clouds. It wasn't high technology, but it was innovation, born of necessity. The best kind of human ingenuity. By the end of the third week, we had established a new normal. Our community had structure, purpose, and increasing confidence in our ability to survive. But we still faced critical shortages. In several areas, most urgently medical supplies. The pharmacy expedition had helped. But with Sarah's pregnancy confirmed and several chronic conditions among our elderly members, we needed to find more. The hospital was nearly a mile away, a journey that would have been challenging in normal times and now seemed nearly impossible, yet we had no choice. I spent 2 days planning the expedition with Hank and Elaine, creating detailed maps, assembling equipment, calculating risks down to the minute of exposure time. I selected a team of 5, myself, Hank, Lisa, Marcus, and Sarah's husband, William. We created impromptu snowshoes that were more sophisticated than our previous versions, using metal brackets salvaged from church pews to provide better stability. We wore multiple layers of clothing with space blankets as the innermost layer to reflect body heat. The morning of our departure, everyone gathered to see us off. I noticed how they had begun incorporating elements from the ceremony I had performed for Jimmy into a new community ritual. Adaptation in action, evolution of culture in real time. As we stepped out into the crystalline, cold, I felt a strange mix of dread and exhilaration. The town I had known my entire life was now buried beneath 20 feet of snow. We were walking atop what had been second-story windows, navigating by the tops of streetlights and church steeples. Our journey had begun, and with it, the most dangerous chapter of our survival so far. The hospital contained resources we desperately needed, but reaching it meant exposing ourselves to the deadliest conditions we had yet faced. Every step took us further from safety, into a world where the cold waited patiently for any mistake, any hesitation. I led our group forward, following the mental map I had created, knowing that what awaited us might determine whether our small community survived or joined the silent, frozen landscape around us. The hospital loomed before us like a ghost ship in a sea of white. Most buildings were now just shapes beneath the snow, but the hospital stood 4 stories tall, its upper floor still visible. We moved carefully, our snowshoes distributing our weight as we crossed what had once been the hospital parking lot, but was now an unbroken field of white. "Stay close," I whispered, though there was no need for quiet. Something about the stillness demanded it. The entrance should be on the east side, 2nd floor now. The landscape was disorienting in its uniformity. Without landmarks, navigation became challenging. I found myself relying on skills my grandmother had taught me, reading subtle changes in snow patterns, identifying which way the wind had shaped the drifts. Knowledge that once seemed quaint now kept us alive. We reached what I believed was the east wing and found a window that would serve as our entrance. Marcus and William worked together to clear the snow and force the window open. A rush of stale air greeted us, surprisingly warm compared to the outside temperature. We entered one by one, careful to secure the window behind us to prevent heat loss. The interior was dark, illuminated only by the flashlights we carried, and the dim, diffused light filtering through snow-covered windows. Walking through those abandoned hallways felt like exploring a tomb. Patient rooms with beds still made, waiting areas with magazines open on tables, a half-filled coffee cup on a nurse's station frozen solid. Life interrupted mid-sentence. "Pharmacy should be on this floor," Elaine whispered, pointing down a corridor. "Supply rooms 1 floor up." We split into 2 groups as planned. Hank, Lisa, and William headed upstairs for general supplies while Elaine and I made for the pharmacy. We had agreed to reconvene in exactly 30 minutes, understanding that longer separation increased risk. The pharmacy doors were locked, but that meant little to people fighting for survival. I used a fire extinguisher to break the reinforced glass, hoping no one was left to care about such transgressions. Inside, we moved methodically, referring to our prepared list, taking only what we needed most urgently: antibiotics, painkillers, insulin for Mr. Chen's diabetes, prenatal vitamins for Sarah, blood pressure medication for several of our elderly. As I filled my pack, I heard a sound that froze my blood more effectively than any cold could. Voices, human voices that weren't from our expedition team. Elaine heard them too, her eyes widening in alarm. We extinguished our flashlights immediately, moving to the back of the pharmacy where cabinets offered some concealment. "Someone's been here recently," a male voice said, echoing down the corridor. "These tracks are fresh." I held my breath, calculating our options. We were armed only with knives. Guns meant bullets, and bullets meant noise that could trigger avalanches. I hadn't considered we might need weapons for protection against other people. A grave oversight. "Fan out, check all rooms. Anyone you find, bring them to the cafeteria. No exceptions." I counted at least 4 distinct voices. Too many to fight directly. I caught Elaine's eye and pointed to the air vent above the medication storage, large enough for a person. She nodded in understanding, working in silence born from desperation. I removed the vent cover and helped Elaine climb inside. I passed our packs up to her, then pulled myself in just as flashlight beams swept the pharmacy entrance. We crawled through the dusty ductwork, navigating by memory toward where I believed the stairwell should be. If we could reach the stairs, we might find our other team members and warn them. We emerged into a janitor's closet on the 3rd floor, breathing hard but undetected. From there, we moved cautiously toward the supply rooms where our team should be gathering materials. Instead, we found William alone, a look of panic on his face. "They took Hank and Lisa," he whispered. "Armed men, at least 6 of them. They went without a fight." The situation had deteriorated rapidly. We were outnumbered, unfamiliar with the territory, and half our team was captured. The supplies we'd gathered were critical for our community's survival, but so were the people we'd brought. I felt the weight of leadership pressing down harder than ever before. "We need more information before we act," I said, working to keep my voice steady. "William, did you see where they took them?" "They mentioned a cafeteria. 2nd floor, north wing," Elaine supplied. "I used to volunteer here." We formulated a hasty plan. William would secure our exit route and prepare for a rapid departure. Elaine and I would reconnoiter the cafeteria, assess the situation, and attempt to make contact with Hank and Lisa. Actual rescue would depend entirely on what we found. Moving through the hospital corridors required every skill I'd developed for walking silently among the bereaved at funerals. Years of ensuring my presence didn't intrude on grief now helped ensure our presence didn't trigger violence. We found the cafeteria and positioned ourselves near a service entrance where we could observe without being seen. The scene inside surprised me. Not a hostile detention, but something more like an impromptu community. Approximately 15 people had converted the cafeteria into a living space. Cots lined the walls. A cooking area had been established around cafeteria equipment modified to run without main power. Children played quietly in one corner. And at a central table, Hank and Lisa sat with a man who appeared to be the leader. They weren't bound or threatened. They were talking, animated but not distressed. I caught fragments of conversation. Different. Approach to the cold, community in the church basement, work together rather than compete. I'd spent my career helping people find peace after loss. Those same skills kept us alive that day. Rather than continuing to hide, I made a decision that might have seemed counterintuitive. I stepped into the open, hands visible, and approached slowly. "I'm looking for my friends," I said calmly. "I believe you've met them already." The reaction was immediate. Several people reached for weapons, but their leader raised his hand to halt them. He studied me with open curiosity. "You must be the Mortician they mentioned." "Karen, was it? Interesting nickname." "Most people find death interesting from a safe distance," I replied. He laughed, genuine amusement rather than menace. "I'm Dr. James Winters, former chief of surgery here. Now I suppose I'm chief of whatever this is." What followed was a tense but productive negotiation. Their group had sheltered in the hospital since the evacuation, believing its medical resources and backup generators made it the most logical choice for survival. They had been aware of other survivors in town, but had adopted a policy of caution, bordering on isolationism. "Resources are finite," Dr. Winters explained. "Each new person reduces everyone's chances." Or increases them, I countered. More hands, more skills, more perspectives. Hank and Lisa had apparently already begun arguing for cooperation rather than competition. Our church group had skills and supplies their hospital group lacked. They had medical expertise and equipment we desperately needed. Collaboration seemed obvious to me, but fear makes people irrational. They had been surviving by avoiding contact with others, seeing everyone as a potential threat. By the time Elaine joined us, having verified William was secure, the atmosphere had shifted from hostile to cautiously optimistic. Dr. Winters agreed to send 2 representatives to visit our church shelter and assess the potential for cooperation, or even eventual merger of our communities. Dr. Winters kept looking at my herb kit as I showed him some of my grandmother's remedies. I should have recognized the hunger in his eyes. At the time, I interpreted it as scientific curiosity, a doctor interested in alternative medicine during a crisis. Only later would I understand what that look truly meant. We departed with our supplies, plus additional medications Dr. Winters provided as a gesture of goodwill. He assigned 2 of his people to accompany us, Dr. Winters' second-in-command, Michael, and a nurse named Rebecca. The return journey was planned for optimal safety, with more people to rotate carrying supplies and watch for hazards. We were halfway back when the blizzard hit without warning. One moment the sky was the usual flat gray, the next, visibility dropped to feet, then inches. Wind howled across the snow-covered landscape, driving ice crystals that cut exposed skin, like tiny blades. The temperature plummeted further, making each breath painful. "Stay together," I shouted above the wind. "Form a line, hold on to the person in front of you." Despite our precautions, we became separated within minutes. The whiteout conditions made orientation impossible. I found myself alone, surrounded by swirling white, unable to see more than an arm's length in any direction. Panic threatened at the edges of my mind, but I forced it back. I recalled my grandmother's technique for finding direction in a whiteout. I knelt and dug through the fresh snow to the more compacted layer beneath, feeling for the subtle crust that forms on the southern side of drifts, where periodic sun exposure creates slight melting. Once I established south, I could navigate roughly toward where our shelter should be. Moving forward against the wind, I shouted periodically for the others, hearing nothing in return. The cold became a physical entity, pressing against me, searching for any vulnerability in my layers. I knew hypothermia would come for me soon if I couldn't find shelter or my companions. After what felt like hours but was likely only 20 minutes, I stumbled across a shape in the snow. Lisa curled into a ball, already showing signs of hypothermia. Her responses were sluggish, her speech slurred. I knew I couldn't leave her, but continuing together would slow us dangerously. In that moment, with Jamie's life literally in my hands, I understood why I'd been spared. My whole life had prepared me for this. I removed my outer coat and wrapped it around her, keeping only the insulating middle layer for myself. Then I hoisted her onto my back in a firefighter's carry I'd learned during mortuary training for moving bodies. The position allowed me to share body heat while continuing to move. Each step became agony as the cold penetrated my reduced protection, but I focused only on the next footfall, the next landmark, the next breath. I don't remember the final approach to our shelter. Hank later told me I appeared out of the storm, like a ghost, Lisa unconscious on my back, my face and hands blue with cold. They pulled us inside, where immediate treatment for severe hypothermia began. When I regained full awareness hours later, I learned the others had found their way back in pairs. William had guided Elaine. Rebecca and Michael had navigated together, using a compass. Only Hank had returned alone, guided by his decades of wilderness experience. Everyone had survived, though Lisa and I had come closest to joining the frozen landscape permanently. The blizzard continued for 2 days, during which our visitors from the hospital group integrated into our routines. Rebecca's nursing skills proved immediately valuable, especially in treating Lisa's hypothermia and frostbite. Michael, who had been a hospital administrator, brought organizational skills that helped us refine our resource management. When the storm finally subsided, we faced a new challenge. The hospital representatives wanted to return to their group to report our successful cooperation. but the storm had transformed the landscape yet again, making the route we had used impossible to retrace. Additionally, our expedition had demonstrated the dangers of traveling between locations. After much discussion, we made a bold proposal. Rather than maintaining two separate groups with occasional dangerous journeys between them, why not merge completely? The church basement had better insulation and heating efficiency. The hospital had more space but was harder to keep warm. By consolidating, we could combine resources, skills, and improve everyone's chances. Rebecca and Michael returned to the hospital with our proposal, accompanied by Hank and Marcus. The journey was tense but uneventful, the weather granting us a brief reprieve. They carried detailed plans for how the merger might work, including space allocations, resource-sharing protocols, and leadership structure proposals. 3 days later, they returned with Dr. Winters and 5 others to inspect our setup personally. The integration of the hospital group into our church basement wasn't without challenges. Space became cramped. Cultural differences in survival approaches created friction. Their group had developed a more hierarchical structure under Dr. Winters' leadership, while ours had evolved toward consensus-based decision-making. I found myself mediating disputes between competing ideologies, drawing on skills I'd developed helping grieving families navigate funeral arrangements. Different people process crisis in different ways. Some need control, others need community. Some focus on the practical, others on the emotional. Funerals taught me how different families handle grief in their own ways. This was the same principle, just with survival instead of mourning. Gradually, we developed a new combined governance structure. Dr. Winters and I served as co-leaders, with a council of specialists managing different aspects of community life. Elaine and Rebecca coordinated medical care. Hank and one of the hospital security guards handled security and expeditions. The Chen family and the hospital cafeteria staff managed food. The merger nearly doubled our numbers, bringing our total community to 43 people. Among them were 2 children, and Sarah with her pregnancy. The presence of new life in our group changed the emotional atmosphere. We weren't just surviving anymore, we were preserving something for the future. By day 25, the full integration was complete. We had expanded our shelter by incorporating adjacent buildings, creating insulated tunnels between structures to allow movement without exposure. Using funeral home UV lamps I had salvaged earlier, we established our first indoor growing operation in the church's former daycare room. The seedlings were small, but represented enormous hope. We developed a sophisticated communication system between buildings using wired intercoms salvaged from the hospital's nurse call system. This allowed us to coordinate activities across our expanding complex without risking outdoor exposure. By day 25, we weren't just surviving anymore. We were beginning to live again. But the winter had one more test for us. I discovered the missing supplies initially by chance. While inventorying our medical stores, I noticed discrepancies between my records and actual quantities. Antibiotics, painkillers, and some specialized equipment had disappeared in small but significant amounts, not enough to notice immediately, but concerning when discovered. I brought my findings to Dr. Winters privately, suspecting human error rather than malicious action. His reaction surprised me. Rather than concern or curiosity, he showed irritation, dismissiveness. Probably just miscounting, he said, or people taking what they need without recording it properly. Something in his manner raised alarm bells in my mind. I began watching more carefully, enlisting Elaine's help to track inventory more precisely. 3 days later, we caught Dr. Winters removing supplies from storage and concealing them in his personal quarters. The confrontation was inevitable. I approached him alone, maintaining a calm exterior despite my inner turmoil. "James," I said, using his first name deliberately, "we need to discuss the missing supplies." His denial lasted only moments before transforming into justification. He believed government help existed in the nearby city of Billings. He had been gathering supplies for an expedition to reach the supposed federal relief center. What's more, he had convinced several others to join him. "The military evacuations went somewhere," he insisted. "They have heat, power, food. We're just suffering needlessly out here. I explained what I knew from the last radio broadcasts, that evacuation centers were overwhelmed, that many had failed when power grids collapsed, that winter conditions were worse near Billings due to its geography. He refused to listen. "You're just afraid of losing your little kingdom," he accused. "You've got everyone believing you're some kind of shaman because of your herbs and mortician tricks." The argument escalated, drawing attention from others. Soon our entire community was involved in the debate. To my dismay, about a third seemed to find Dr. Winter's argument compelling. The promise of proper government help, of returning to civilization, was a powerful lure after nearly a month in our improvised shelter. In my years as a mortician, I learned that you can't force people to accept reality. Some need to find their own way to the truth. After hours of heated discussion, I made a painful decision. Rather than force people to stay, we would divide our supplies proportionally. Those who wished to search for government help could go, with a fair share of resources. "I believe you're making a mistake," I told Dr. Winters quietly. "But I won't keep anyone against their will, nor send anyone away empty-handed." The division was set for the following morning. But as we prepared for the split, our weather radio, still monitored despite lack of broadcasts, suddenly crackled to life with an emergency signal. A computerized voice warned of an unprecedented storm front approaching our region. Barometric pressure was dropping to record levels. Temperatures would likely fall below -50. Anyone caught outside would face certain death. Dr. Winters's departure plans were instantly put on hold. Instead, we turned our attention to securing our shelter against what might be the most severe weather event yet. The moment of crisis had transformed conflict back into cooperation, at least temporarily. I instructed everyone on emergency preparations, drawing on everything I had learned in the past weeks. We reinforced walls and ceilings, consolidated our living space to the most insulated central rooms, prepared emergency heating solutions using chemicals from my mortuary supplies, created a rotation schedule for monitoring structural integrity during the storm. As we worked, I found myself wondering if this would be our last stand against the winter. The ancestors spoke of winters that lasted generations. I never thought I'd see such tales come true. The warning about the approaching storm created a strange moment of unity. Even Dr. Winters set aside his plans for departure to help with preparations. We worked through the night, reinforcing structures, gathering everyone into our most protected spaces, and preparing for what the Weather Service had called an event of unprecedented severity. As the others worked, I retreated briefly to the mortuary office I had converted into my private quarters. In the small metal box my grandmother had given me years ago, I kept her medicine bundle, a collection of sacred herbs, small carved objects, and personal items she claimed connected her to our ancestors. I had always respected these traditions without fully embracing them. Science and tradition occupied separate compartments in my mind. But that night, alone with the weight of 43 lives partially on my shoulders, I found myself performing the ritual she had taught me. I laid out the bundle, burned a small amount of sage, and spoke words asking for guidance and protection. Even as I did it, part of me felt foolish. Yet another part found comfort in the familiar motions, the connection to something older than our current crisis. Whether it was exhaustion, stress, or something more mystical, I experienced something unusual as I completed the ritual. For a brief moment, I thought I saw shapes in the curling smoke, figures moving through swirling snow. I felt my grandmother's presence as clearly as if she stood beside me. "Remember," she seemed to say, "winter always ends." I returned to the group with renewed purpose, a clarity I hadn't felt since the crisis began. The practical part of my mind dismissed the experience as a stress response, but something deeper had been affected. I had connected with a reservoir of strength I hadn't known was there. The storm hit just before dawn on day 27. Even within our reinforced shelter, we could hear its fury. The wind screamed around corners and through tiny gaps in our insulation. The temperature dropped so rapidly that frost formed on interior walls despite our heating efforts. The building itself seemed to groan under the strain, wooden beams creaking ominously as snow and ice accumulated on the roof. I organized our group into rotating teams. Some tended fires and monitored carbon monoxide levels. Others watched for structural weaknesses. A third group managed food preparation and rationing. The final team focused on medical needs and morale. Everyone had a purpose, a role that contributed to our collective survival. Around midday, a sound like a gunshot echoed through our shelter. One of the main support beams in the church basement had developed a crack. The weight of accumulated snow on the roof above was becoming too much for the structure to bear. If the beam failed completely, a section of ceiling would collapse, exposing us to the deadly cold and potentially triggering a cascade of structural failures. We needed an immediate solution. The beam couldn't be replaced without specialized equipment we didn't have. It needed reinforcement, and quickly. I thought of the mortuary equipment we had salvaged earlier, specifically the embalming table. Made of solid stainless steel with adjustable height, it might serve as an emergency support column. 6 of us worked together to retrieve the table from storage and position it beneath the cracking beam. We extended it to its maximum height, then used wooden shims to create a tight fit. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it might hold long enough for us to develop one. Throughout the night, we took turns monitoring the beam and its makeshift support. Every creak and groan from the building sent spikes of anxiety through the group. We had nowhere else to go. If this shelter failed, we would be at the mercy of a storm that showed no mercy. Death had come for our shelter. I refused to prepare this body. In the darkest hours of that night, when the storm's fury reached its peak, something unexpected happened. Someone began pounding on our emergency exit door. At first, we thought it was debris thrown by the wind. Then the pounding formed a distinct pattern. 3 quick knocks, pause, 3 more. A human signal. Hank, Marcus, and I approached the door cautiously. Opening it meant risking our warmth and safety, but someone was out there in conditions that meant certain death without shelter. We developed a rapid plan. Open the door just enough for entry, have blankets and warming protocols ready, be prepared for any threat. When we finally opened the door, the wind nearly tore it from our grasp. Through the swirling snow, figures appeared, human shapes heavily bundled and crusted with ice. We pulled them inside quickly, securing the door against the storm. 5 people collapsed on our floor, their faces unrecognizable behind frost-covered masks and goggles. As we helped remove their frozen outer layers and began warming procedures, I recognized the first face revealed. Mayor Reynolds, who had left with the evacuation nearly a month earlier. Behind him, 4 others from our town, who had similarly evacuated. Among them, Dr. Winter's former colleague, Dr. Andrea Chen, sister to our own Lisa Chen. When they could finally speak, their story emerged in fragments. The evacuation center in Billings had been overwhelmed, just as I had feared. Too many people, too few resources. When the power grid failed completely 2 weeks ago, the military had triaged evacuees, prioritizing those with special skills or medical needs. The rest were given basic supplies and told to seek private accommodations, a cruel joke when the entire region was buried under snow and ice. Our returning townspeople had formed a small group and set out to return home, believing their chances better in a familiar environment. They'd been traveling for days, using abandoned vehicles for shelter at night, navigating by memory through a transformed landscape. The approaching superstorm had forced them to make a final desperate push to reach town. "We saw your smoke," Mayor Reynolds explained hoarsely. "Otherwise, we would have walked right past. Everything looks different under the snow." They looked at our little community with wonder. What we'd built from nothing but necessity and will seemed miraculous to them. Their arrival brought mixed emotions: joy at seeing familiar faces, satisfaction that our decision to stay had been vindicated, concern about 5 more people to shelter and feed. Among the new arrivals, I was surprised to see Dr. Winter's face light up with recognition. Dr. Andrea Chen was more than just a colleague, I realized. Their embrace spoke of a deeper connection. Later, I would learn they had been engaged before the crisis, separated by her assignment to the evacuation medical team. The storm continued for another full day, but its fury had peaked. By morning of day 29, it had diminished enough for us to assess damage to our expanded shelter complex. The church roof had developed several leaks that needed immediate attention. 2 of our tunnels connecting adjacent buildings had partially collapsed, but the core of our shelter remained intact, protected by our vigilance and improvised engineering. More surprising than the structural condition was the change in temperature. For the first time since the crisis began, the temperature had risen slightly. Not enough to celebrate, still well below zero, but the trend offered a glimmer of hope that the worst might be passing. That afternoon, something even more remarkable happened. Our weather radio, silent for days except for the automated warning system, picked up a transmission. Weak and filled with static, but undeniably human voices. We gathered around as Hank carefully adjusted the tuning. "This is Montana State Scientific Outpost Bravo broadcasting on emergency channels. Any survivors in the Helena region, please respond." We had no way to respond. Our radio was receive only, but the transmission continued periodically throughout the day. We learned that a scientific team had established a research station in the mountains west of Helena, powered by geothermal sources. They were collecting climate data and attempting to coordinate with other survivor groups. Most importantly, they shared meteorological models suggesting the worst of the cooling had peaked. Temperatures would remain dangerously low for months, perhaps years, but the rapid decline had stopped. The ash from the volcanic eruptions was beginning to dissipate in the upper atmosphere. It wasn't a return to normal, but it was the first scientific evidence that this new ice age might not be permanent. The community council meeting that evening was the most hopeful we'd held since the crisis began. With information from the scientific outpost and the experiences of our returned evacuees, we could begin planning beyond mere survival. Dr. Winters, humbled by the failure of his evacuation plan and reunited with his fiancée, approached me privately. "I was wrong," he said simply, "about the evacuation centers, about you. We developed a framework for truly sustainable survival. The Chen family's agricultural knowledge, combined with my preserved seeds and UV lamps, expanded our indoor growing operation. Dr. Chen's expertise in emergency medicine complemented Elaine's nursing skills and my herbal knowledge. The mayor's administrative experience helped us create a fair system for work assignment and resource distribution. On the morning of day 30, I stood in our makeshift greenhouse, watching the tiny seedlings reaching toward the artificial light. These plants represented more than food. They were a bridge to the future, evidence of our refusal to surrender to the ice. My official role had evolved beyond medical practitioner to include community historian. I maintained records of our experiences, decisions, and adaptations, ensuring knowledge wouldn't be lost if individuals perished. We held a ceremony that evening, marking 1 month since the evacuation. We honored those we had lost, Jimmy to the early cold, 2 of Dr. Winters's group who had died before the merger, and countless unknown others across the frozen landscape. I incorporated elements from my grandmother's traditions. Mayor Reynolds added Christian prayers, and others contributed their own cultural remembrances. It wasn't any formal religion, but something new emerging from our shared experience. My grandmother believed that ends and beginnings were the same thing, just viewed from different directions, I told the assembled group. Day 30 isn't an endpoint, it's our true beginning. Looking around at these people, some I had known my entire life, others I had met only through crisis, I reflected on how thoroughly we had been transformed. The mortician had become a healer, the drunk had become a leader, the bereaved had become a community. The tools and knowledge I had developed for tending to the dead had become instrumental in preserving the living. The chemicals used to prepare bodies now purified our water and reinforced our structures. The anatomy knowledge that helped me make the deceased presentable now helped me treat frostbite and hypothermia. The emotional intelligence developed through years of helping families through grief now helped me mediate conflicts and build consensus. My grandmother had always insisted that death wasn't separate from life but an integral part of it. I understood that teaching more fully now. The skills of death attendants were, at their core, skills of honoring life's transitions. And what Was our current situation, if not a massive transition? The world we knew had died. We were midwifing something new into existence. The Scientific Outpost's broadcast became a regular feature of our days, providing both practical information and psychological connection to the wider world. They reported similar survivor communities forming across the northern regions, each developing unique adaptations to their circumstances. Some had technology we lacked, others had developed innovations we might adopt. The outpost promised to facilitate information exchange as communication networks gradually rebuilt. On what we now marked as Day 30, I made my usual rounds through our expanded shelter complex. I checked on Sarah, whose pregnancy was progressing well despite the circumstances. I reviewed inventory with the supply team, discussed tunnel reinforcement with the engineering group, and assisted Dr. Chen with treating minor frostbite on one of the recent arrivals. That evening, I added to the community journal I had been maintaining, recording not just events but observations about how we were changing, adapting. I noted the pallor that had developed on everyone's skin from lack of sunlight, but also the improved night vision many reported. I documented how our bodies seemed to be adjusting metabolically to the cold and limited food, becoming more efficient with resources. We were becoming something new, I wrote. Not quite the winter spirits of my grandmother's stories, but perhaps their human counterparts. Snow people adapting to a frozen world, carrying the memory of warmth within us like a dormant seed waiting for spring. As I completed my entry, Dr. Chen approached me with results from her examination of our garden seedlings. Despite the artificial conditions, they were showing remarkable adaptability, developing more efficient photosynthesis processes in response to limited light. Nature, as always, found a way forward. Life persisted, even in the most hostile conditions. They say this winter might last years, maybe decades. The scientific models can't predict exactly when or how the climate might stabilize or recover. But I've learned something important in these 30 days. Where there's life, there's hope. And where there's hope, spring will eventually follow. My grandmother would say the winter spirits weren't cruel, merely necessary. They brought the deep rest that makes renewal possible. Perhaps this global winter serves some purpose we can't yet comprehend. Or perhaps it's simply a natural disaster we must endure. Either way, we continue. We adapt. We preserve what matters most: our humanity, our knowledge, our capacity for compassion even in the coldest dark. On the evening of Day 30, I walked our perimeter check with Hank, verifying our security before night. We had developed a routine of checking for structural weaknesses, monitoring temperatures in different sections, and ensuring all systems were functioning properly. As we completed our circuit, we stopped at what had once been the church's rear exit but was now a window-like opening above the snow level. Through a small cleared section of glass, we could see the night sky. For the first time in weeks, the clouds had partially cleared, revealing a few stars glittering in the blackness. Their cold light reflected off the endless snow, creating an otherworldly landscape both beautiful and terrible. Different world now, Hank said quietly. But still our world, I replied. We stood there for a moment longer, witnesses to a transformed Earth. Then we returned to the warmth of our community, to the next challenge, the next day, the next adaptation. This is how we survive. One day, becoming 30, 30 becoming a year. However long this winter lasts, we will endure it together. Now let me tell you about Day 31. Day 31 brought with it both routine and surprise. The routine was comforting. Our morning council meeting, work rotation assignments, equipment checks. The surprise came at mid-morning, when Marcus burst into the medical station where I was treating Mrs. Wilson's persistent cough with one of my grandmother's herbal remedies. "Sharon," he said, his breath coming in quick clouds. "There's someone on the radio asking specifically for you." I followed him quickly to our communications center, a salvaged desk in what had once been the pastor's office, now crammed with radio equipment. Hank sat at the controls, carefully adjusting dials to maintain the signal through the atmospheric interference. "This is Outpost Bravo calling for Wyeth Blackwood," A female voice crackled through the static. Repeat, looking for Wyeth Blackwood of Montana. Please respond if you're receiving. Hank had modified our receiver into a transmitter using parts scavenged from the hospital's equipment. The connection was unreliable, but it worked well enough for basic communication. This is Wyeth, I responded, using my given name rather than my nickname. Who am I speaking with? Dr. Samira Khatri, climate scientist. Your cousin Michael is here with us at Outpost Bravo. He made it to us a week ago from Billings and told us you might have established a survivor community. Michael had been among those who evacuated. I hadn't seen him in years before the crisis, but we had grown up together on the reservation. The fact that he had survived and remembered me sent a wave of emotion through me that I struggled to contain. We've established a shelter in town, I confirmed. 48 survivors currently. Stable but limited resources. What followed was a detailed exchange of information. Outpost Bravo had been a research station before the crisis, studying climate patterns in the Rocky Mountains. Its geothermal power source had allowed it to remain operational when the grid failed. They had scientific equipment, data, and expertise that put our situation into broader context. The picture Dr. Khatri painted was sobering but not without hope. The volcanic eruptions had ejected unprecedented amounts of ash into the upper atmosphere, creating a cooling effect more severe than initially predicted. Global temperatures had dropped an average of 15 degrees Fahrenheit, with more extreme effects in northern regions. But their model suggested the cooling had reached its peak. Temperatures would remain dangerously low for years, perhaps decades, but the rapid decline had stopped. There's more, she said. We're coordinating with other survivor communities across the region, creating a network for resource sharing and information exchange. Your location could be an important node in that network. The implications were enormous. We weren't alone. Organized human society still existed, adapting to the new reality rather than collapsing entirely. There was a framework emerging for long-term survival beyond our isolated community. I brought this information to our full council immediately. The reactions ranged from cautious optimism to skepticism. Dr. Winters, in particular, seemed conflicted. How do we know this isn't another false promise like the evacuation centers, he asked. It was a fair question. Hope had betrayed many already, but the scientific details Dr. Khatri had shared rang true, and Michael's presence at their facility lent credibility. We agreed to maintain communication with Outpost Bravo, while proceeding cautiously with any commitments. That evening, a more immediate concern demanded our attention. Dr. Chen approached me privately after dinner, her expression grave. The meteorological data from Outpost Bravo confirms what I've been suspecting, she said quietly. The structural issues we've been experiencing aren't just from snow weight. The permafrost is forming under the foundation. The ground is freezing, deeper than it ever has before. This was dangerous news. Buildings in our region weren't designed for permafrost conditions. As the ground froze to greater depths, it would shift and heave, potentially compromising even our most solid structures. How long do we have, I asked. Before significant structural damage? Hard to say exactly. Weeks, not months. We need a more sustainable shelter solution, Wyeth. I spent that night in my quarters, reviewing old journals my grandmother had kept. She had documented traditional winter shelters used by our ancestors during particularly harsh seasons. Semi-subterranean structures that used Earth's natural insulation. Techniques for building with snow itself as an insulating material. Knowledge that had seemed quaint in the modern world now represented survival. The next morning, I presented a radical proposal to the council. Rather than continuing to fight against the new reality by trying to maintain structures designed for a warmer world, we would adapt more fundamentally. We would build a new central shelter incorporating traditional cold-weather design principles, with modern materials we could salvage. It's traditional knowledge with scientific validation, I explained. Structures partially below ground level, with thick insulated walls, minimal windows, and carefully designed ventilation. Our ancestors knew how to survive winters far colder than anything modern Americans have experienced. The debate was intense. Some argued we should focus on reinforcing our existing shelter. Others believed we should attempt to reach Outpost Bravo despite the dangers of travel. Dr. Winters supported my proposal, lending his scientific authority to the traditional knowledge I presented. Modern buildings are failing us, he stated simply. Maybe it's time to try something older. While the council deliberated, a new crisis emerged. Lisa Chen, who had been monitoring our communication with Outpost Bravo, detected a transmission on an emergency frequency. Another survivor group, much smaller than ours, had established themselves in what had been a highway maintenance depot about 5 miles from our location. They were running dangerously low on food and medical supplies. Their shelter was failing. They needed help immediately. The timing couldn't have been worse. We were facing our own structural challenges. Our resources were carefully balanced for our current population. Taking in more people would strain that balance. But the alternative was leaving fellow humans to die when we had the means to help them. I found myself torn between practical concerns for our community and the moral imperative to help others. This wasn't a decision I could or should make alone. I called an emergency community meeting, presenting the situation honestly, including both the risks of helping and the costs of turning away. I won't pretend this is an easy choice, I told everyone gathered in our main living area. If we bring these people in, we all eat less. We all have less space. But if we turn them away, we lose something of ourselves, something essential. The debate was respectful but passionate. Valid points were raised on both sides. In the end, we voted 41-7 in favor of mounting a rescue operation. Even knowing the sacrifices it would entail, our community chose compassion over comfort. The rescue mission would be dangerous. 5 miles in these conditions represented a significant journey with substantial risk. We prepared meticulously, using everything we had learned from previous expeditions. 6 volunteers would make the attempt. Myself, Hank, Marcus, Dr. Winters, Mayor Reynolds, and Rebecca from the hospital group. The morning of our departure, day 33 since the evacuation, the temperature had risen slightly again. Not enough to matter practically, but psychologically it felt significant. A pattern was emerging. The killing cold was very gradually relenting. We set out at dawn, following GPS coordinates provided in the emergency transmission. Our improved equipment and experience made travel more efficient than our earlier expeditions. We had developed better snowshoes, cold weather protocols, and navigation methods. Still, every moment outside represented danger. The highway maintenance depot came into view around midday. Unlike our town buildings, it was a low-slung structure, partially visible above the snow. Smoke rose from an improvised chimney, confirming occupancy. We approached cautiously, alert for any signs of deception or threat. "Hello, the depot," Mayor Reynolds called as we came within earshot. "We received your transmission and have come to help." A figure emerged cautiously from what appeared to be an emergency exit that now functioned as their main door. A woman, heavily bundled against the cold, rifle held low but ready. "Identify yourselves," she called back. "Survivors from town," I replied. "We have a sheltered community. Food, medicine, we've come to bring you to safety." What followed was a tense but ultimately peaceful encounter. The depot group consisted of 11 people, highway workers who had been on shift when the worst hit, plus a family whose car had broken down nearby. They had survived on emergency supplies and creativity, but their situation had grown desperate as their generator fuel dwindled and food stores depleted. Their leader, Maria Delgado, had been the depot's supervisor. She was clearly exhausted, but maintained a dignity and authority that I immediately respected. She lowered her rifle as we approached, but I noticed her people remained vigilantly, positioned around the structure. "We didn't know if anyone else had survived locally," she explained once we were inside. "We've been trying different frequencies for weeks." The depot was cold, significantly colder than our shelter. They had been living primarily in what had been the break room, burning furniture in a makeshift stove. Medical supplies were virtually non-existent. Food was down to a few cans. 2 people showed signs of advanced frostbite, one with a potentially life-threatening infection. Dr. Winters immediately attended to the medical emergencies while the rest of us explained our community and the plan to transport everyone back. Maria was understandably cautious, asking pointed questions about our resources, leadership structure, and expectations. "We vote on major decisions," I explained. "Everyone contributes according to ability. Everyone receives according to need." "And what happens when needs exceed resources?" she asked bluntly. It was the question at the heart of survival ethics, one we had wrestled with repeatedly. "Then we find more resources, or we adapt our needs," I said. Together. The journey back was slow and difficult. The 2 injured depot survivors had to be transported on improvised sleds, requiring frequent rotation of pullers. We moved in a tight formation, using ropes to stay connected when visibility decreased. The weather held, but exhaustion and cold took their toll on everyone. We were perhaps a mile from our shelter when one of the injured men, delirious with infection, began struggling against his restraints. In his confusion, he tumbled from the sled, pulling his attendant down with him. Both plunged through what looked like solid ground but was actually a snow bridge over a drainage ditch. The fall wasn't far, perhaps 8 feet, but in these conditions, any injury or additional exposure could be fatal. I descended immediately, securing a rope around my waist with Hank anchoring above. The ditch was dark, the snow walls pressing in from all sides. The attendant, Lisa Chen's husband, William, had landed awkwardly, his leg bent at an unnatural angle. The injured man lay unconscious, his breathing shallow. Working quickly in the confined space, I stabilized William's leg with improvised splints and managed to secure both men for extraction. The team above pulled us up one by one. It was a near disaster averted only by preparation and quick action. When we finally reached our shelter complex, exhausted and frost-nipped but alive, the integration process began immediately. The depot survivors were overwhelmed by the relative warmth and organization of our community. Simple things we now took for granted, regular meals, medical care, space to sleep, seemed miraculous to people who had been surviving on the edge for weeks. That evening, with 11 new members added to our community, we held a special council meeting to address our increasingly urgent shelter situation. The proposal I had developed from my grandmother's journals gained new support in light of our expanded population and the continuing structural concerns. Dr. Chen presented her analysis of the permafrost development, showing how it would eventually compromise even our church basement. Mayor Reynolds offered administrative expertise for organizing the massive project of constructing a new shelter. Dr. Winters contributed scientific validation of the traditional designs I had proposed. Together, we developed a comprehensive plan for what we began calling New Shelter. It would incorporate elements from indigenous winter lodges, Scandinavian earth houses, and modern insulation techniques. The location would be the town park, where the terrain allowed for partial excavation into the hillside for natural insulation. We would salvage materials from buildings that were already failing, creating something new from the remnants of our previous world. The project would require everyone's contribution. It would be difficult, dangerous at times, and would consume most of our energy for weeks. But it represented something beyond mere survival. It was adaptation, evolution, the beginning of building rather than just enduring. As we finalized the plans, Maria from the depot group raised her hand to speak. "I've been a civil engineer for 20 years before becoming depot supervisor," she said. "I'd like to offer my expertise to this project." It was a perfect example of how our community continued to discover new strengths with each person who joined us. Skills and knowledge we hadn't known we needed suddenly appeared just when required. Perhaps this was how humanity had always survived its darkest periods, through collective wisdom, shared burden, and unexpected gifts. That night, I returned to my private ritual with my grandmother's medicine bundle. The experience was different. This time, less desperate prayer, more grateful connection. I felt her presence again, not as a mysterious vision, but as a continuation of knowledge passed through generations. The tools for survival had always been there, preserved in stories and practices I had only partially embraced before the crisis. "Winter always ends," I whispered, repeating what I had heard in my previous vision. The construction of new shelter began the next morning. Every able-bodied community member had an assigned role based on skills and physical capability. Those with construction experience directed the work. Those with strength provided labor. Those with medical or organizational skills supported the workers and maintained our existing shelter during the transition. We worked in short shifts to minimize cold exposure, rotating teams throughout the day. Progress was slow but steady. The excavation into the hillside was particularly challenging with the ground partially frozen, but we developed techniques using salvaged metal heated in fires to cut through the soil. By the end of day 35, the basic footprint of new shelter had been established, a roughly circular design with radiating rooms partially underground, with thick walls built from compacted snow, earth, and salvaged insulation. Central support beams came from the town's lumberyard, carefully extracted and transported to the site. The work itself became a kind of community ritual. People who had been strangers before the crisis now worked side by side, learning to anticipate each other's needs, developing the wordless coordination that comes from shared purpose. The physical labor provided focus for anxious minds and exhausted bodies alike. On the morning of day 36, we received another communication from Outpost Bravo. Dr. Khatri reported that their network now extended to 17 survivor communities across Montana and Wyoming. Each had developed unique adaptations to their circumstances, and Outpost Bravo was facilitating knowledge exchange. "Your new shelter design has generated significant interest," she told me during our scheduled radio contact. "Several communities are considering similar approaches. Would you be willing to document your process and share it through our network?" Thus I gained another role, chronicler of our adaptation. Each evening, I recorded detailed notes on our construction techniques, the materials we used, the challenges we encountered and overcame. This wasn't just for other communities. It was for future generations who might need this knowledge again. The scientists at Outpost Bravo provided additional information about our changed world. The volcanic winter we were experiencing had precedents in Earth's history, though none in recorded human experience. Previous volcanic winters had lasted from 2 to 10 years, depending on the scale of eruptions and atmospheric conditions. Our situation appeared to be on the severe end of that spectrum. The good news, Dr. Khatri explained, is that these events always end. The Earth has built-in repair mechanisms. The bad news is that normal will be redefined. When this passes, the climate will still be altered for decades. We're not going back to what we knew. We're going somewhere new. This information reinforced the importance of our new shelter. We weren't building a temporary refuge, but potentially a home for years to come. The design incorporated this understanding with spaces for expanded food production, communal gathering, and private areas for individuals and families. On day 37, Sarah Jenkins went into early labor. The combination of stress, limited nutrition, and cold had triggered premature birth. Our medical team, Dr. Chen, Elaine, and Rebecca, prepared as best they could with limited equipment. I supplied herbs traditionally used to ease childbirth and strengthen contractions. For 12 hours, our community held its collective breath. Most continued working on new shelter, understanding the increased urgency of completing protected space. Some gathered near the medical area, ready to assist if needed. I moved between both groups, coordinating efforts and providing updates. Shortly after midnight, a new cry joined our community. A girl, small but healthy considering the circumstances, the first child born into our new world. William and Sarah named her Aurora, after the northern lights and, they said, as a symbol of beauty that exists even in darkness. Aurora's birth transformed our community's mood. The construction of new shelter gained new purpose and urgency. We weren't just building for ourselves now, but for a future generation who would grow up in this changed world. Every decision took on additional weight. How would we educate children born into this reality? What knowledge would be most important to preserve for them? By day 39, the main structure of new shelter was complete enough for the most vulnerable members of our community to begin moving in. The temperature inside, while not warm by pre-crisis standards, maintained a consistent level above freezing without constant fire tending. The semi-subterranean design with its thick walls provided remarkable insulation. The central chamber featured a sophisticated ventilation system that allowed for fire heating without smoke accumulation. Sleeping areas radiated outward like spokes of a wheel, with the most protected spaces reserved for the elderly, ill, and now for Sarah and Aurora. The design incorporated storage areas for food and supplies, a medical treatment room, and even a small growing chamber, where we transplanted our seedlings from the church basement. On the morning of day 40, as we continued the moving process, our weather equipment detected another significant cold front approaching. Not as severe as the previous superstorm, but dangerous nonetheless. The timing was either fortunate or catastrophic, depending on perspective. Our new shelter was functional, but incomplete. Our old shelter was increasingly compromised by permafrost heaving. We accelerated the transition, working around the clock to transfer essential supplies and ensure new shelter could accommodate everyone if necessary. The storm hit earlier than predicted, forcing a decision. Dr. Winters, Mayor Reynolds, and I agreed that complete evacuation of the old shelter was the safest option, even with new shelter not fully ready. By evening, all 60 people were consolidated in new shelter, crowded but secure. The storm raged above us, but inside, the temperature remained stable. The earth and snow insulation proved even more effective than we had hoped. For the first time since the crisis began, we weren't fighting a constant battle against the cold. As we settled into our new home that night, gathered around the central fire pit, I looked at the faces illuminated by the flames, strangers who had become family, competitors who had become collaborators, the grieving who had found purpose, the lost who had found community. My grandmother believed that ends and beginnings were the same thing, just viewed from different directions. These 40 days had been the end of one world and the beginning of another. I had begun as a mortician, a tender of endings. Now I found myself a keeper of beginnings. The radio from Outpost Bravo crackled with the evening transmission. More communities joining the network, more knowledge being shared, plans for spring planting in protected greenhouses, methods for ice fishing through the frozen lakes, techniques for maintaining mental health during limited daylight, humanity adapting as it always had. They say this winter might last years, maybe decades. But I've learned something important in these 40 days. Where there's life, there's hope. And where there's hope, spring will eventually follow. In the small growing chamber at the heart of new shelter, a seedling had emerged from the soil. A tiny green shoot reaching toward the artificial light. I knelt beside it each evening, watching its slow, determined progress. It wasn't just a plant. It was a promise. A reminder that even in the deepest freeze, life persists. Winter always ends, and when it does, we'll be ready.